Thank you, Antonio, for this very interesting paper. Now, the question time, and the floor is open to questions, if any. Please.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I come from the robot ethics space, and I did 2 suggestions for scholars who might contribute to this thinking, and then one suggestion for an experiment. The first is Sherry Turkle. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she's written a book called Alone Together, and she explores this question of children interacting with robots. So I said I'm from the robot space so that you know that my examples are robotics rather than sort of the digital environment. But in this book, she does look at the meaning. So it's small-scale qualitative research, but the meaning of children interacting with robots. Shannon Valor is also another person that would be interesting. She looks at the character development or virtue development in a digital context, also making reference to robots. But picking up on the deontic logic, I like the idea of working with children and understanding how, what is the moral development that's happening, but I think there's also situations where we could look at adults.
Sorry?
There's also situations where we could look at adults about their moral development when they're interacting with new robots. And so you might consider looking at adults interacting with personal home assistants, like the Google Home or the Amazon Alexa, and what is the deontic logic that is forming right now, right? Because it's very much this social experiment that we're in the middle of. So just as an interesting idea to throw out there, it could make for a really interesting experiment.
Thank you very much.
Please, Antonio. Would you collect other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Professor Reichberg. Please.
I just have more of an observation than a question, but I think Siri is a kind of robot. And I saw my 10-year-old swearing at Siri. It was fun to be abusive towards Siri. And that concerned me. And his supposition was it's just a robot, doesn't have feelings, in which I agree. But on the other hand, it was as though this was somehow setting him up for an acceptable form of behavior, which isn't. So there's stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah. Third one, Frank, please.
So I was thinking that when I consider the role of robotics and AI and laptops for all in tech, I have this double sense, and part of me thinks that this is so wonderful for people that have no other alternative, and I know that in many parts of the world there's no qualified teacher available. But I know also in the US now there are these laptop schools in Kansas where they just have the kids sitting at a laptop all day and they don't really interact with teachers much. And the worry in books by Neil Selwyn wrote a book called Should Robots Replace Teachers? It'll come out in a few months, is that if you create the sense that the technology is the equivalent to or a substitute for a person, that there are often economic pressures to use it to displace people. And I was wondering maybe if that might be an interesting thing to study is, are there ways to avoid that economic pressure towards the displacement of the human as opposed to the complementing of the human?
Thank you.
Thanks. Gilles.
Yeah, I wonder if one difference between the real world and the digital world is that in the real world, our ethics is mostly deontologic, so there are rules to cross the street, rules to behave, while in the digital world, we don't have such rules, but we have values, so it's more virtue ethics. For instance, there are no rules that forbid you to insult someone on a website, but there are values according to which this is wrong. And we have here an opportunity not only to observe how children build and understand rules, but also how they build values, which may be more interesting for the digital world.
Thank you.
Okay, any other question? Antonio, please, you have five minutes. Antonio, please.
Well, about values, about robots representing teachers, I think a way to avoid that, about the robots represent, is that the children are nowadays building robots. They are not buying a robot. They are making robots, which is a completely different thing. And then they can do, can be very simple robots. For instance, if we imitate a car or a crossing, it can be perfectly well for them to produce a car that stops in the red light or not, or something like that. Therefore, I think I'm not much more, in this experiment, not much more concerned about having robots in places that come from outside by building robots. And then this building a robot, that we are doing that in many, many places, is a very impressive teaching and learning opportunities. This is all. And for values, of course. And values is different for laws of codes. It's a different level. And we must study that. Thank you. And thank you for that. I will see. And Madam?
Because it's clearly in my focus in my research, this topic, this co-adaptation, human-machine co-adaptation. For education, I was in Brazil, and I've seen a lot of very interesting teaching with robots, but in the way you propose, for creative things, for explaining, a robot able to explain what kind of things he is doing, and even with very cheap things, no complex robots. The other thing is we use robots, for example, for autistic children, in a sense which is very interesting. It's not like a companion to interact, but like a medium. So the children speak, in fact, just put some information and the robot is speaking for the children. And this is very efficient, these kind of things. So to experiment, and much more than, as you say, to create with people something else. And I think it's fundamental also for the difference of gender to do that at the school, at the very low school, for children at 6 years old, I think, to learn what is the algorithm, what is a loop, what is a variable, and what kind of automatic things we can propose. And to demystify AI and robotics is the best way.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.